This subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. In 1962, President John Kennedy first imposed the trade embargo on Cuba after communist dictator Fidel Castro took over. 50 years later, Cuba is still communist. The Castros are still in control. They continue to imprison political dissidents. They do not respect the human rights of their own people. And among other things, there are at least 6,000 claims of Americans who've had their property stolen by the Castro brothers and are not resolved, totaling about $8 billion. This past December, the president announced that he would move to normalize relations with Cuba. Last month, the U.S. Embassy in Havana reopened for the first time in 54 years. News agencies are now reporting that the president plans to unilaterally lift travel restrictions to Cuba. This hearing on agricultural trade with Cuba comes at a time when a lot of change in our policy toward Cuba. And I'll reiterate, the hearing is about trade with Cuba. 2000, Congress carved out JFK's trade embargo agricultural commodities so our farmers could export to Cuba. Exports rose, hitting about $685 million in 2008, making up 42% of the Cuban market. Since then, exports have dropped. U.S. wheat and rice farmers went from providing over 40% of Cuba's supply to now not supplying any. The U.S. has not exported rice since 2009 and wheat since 2011. Cuba gets its wheat and rice from Vietnam, Venezuela, and Brazil. Sometimes it's difficult to understand why. Some of this very well may be because the communist Cuban government is manipulating the market. Maybe the Castro brothers don't want to buy American rice even though it's cheaper, and it's certainly better than rice from other places in the world. We know the Cuban government already discriminates against our farmers. Unlike with other foreign competitors, the Cuban government forces American farmers to sell their goods to a state-owned company called Alimport. This requirement by the Cuban government raises the cost of doing business for U.S. farmers, makes them less competitive against their foreign counterparts. There are other hurdles that make our farmers at a competitive disadvantage. Unlike foreign competitors, the U.S. exporters cannot offer terms of credit to Cuban buyers. That means Cuba has to make all payments up front in cash. If the U.S. government allowed our exporters to offer terms of credit to Cuba, maybe our exporters would understand that the U.S. government will not. Let me re-say that again. If the U.S. government allowed our exporters to offer terms of credit, our exporters understand that the U.S. government will not bail them out if Cuba does not pay its debt. If our farmers want to take that risk, then maybe that we should let them take that risk. It's already U.S. policy. Agricultural goods are not subject to the embargo, but that restrictions we have left in place makes it hard for our farmers to trade at all. This half-in, half-out trading environment doesn't make much sense to me. It is clear that the U.S. could be a strong contender in the Cuban market. Before the embargo, Cuba was typically the largest commercial market for U.S. long-grain rice exports. Cuba often took more than half the U.S. annual long-grain sales and almost 1/3 of our total rice exports. In my home state of Texas, I have represented many rice farmers. They grow long-grain rice as they do in, I believe, Arkansas as well. Their original markets for long-grain rice, hey, when I got to Congress, I thought rocks came in a box. So there's long-grain rice, there's short-grain rice. The markets for long-grain rice were Iran, Iraq, and Cuba. Bummer. So they're looking for markets. Many rice farmers have literally gone out of business, and they're doing something else with their land. U.S. exporters have an advantage over foreign competitors because of the distance between the United States and Cuba. It's about 100 miles. That means lower shipping costs and transit times, which are especially important when shipping perishable goods. Ports like Mobile, Alabama, Miami, New Orleans, and Houston will have an opportunity to become a major export. The Port of Houston is a natural gateway for trade with Cuba because it has a lot of products that Cuba needs. Exporting to Cuba would also require no new infrastructure because American exporters have a strong foothold in the Caribbean and Latin American markets. The rice market has a lot of potential because of U.S. exporters can provide high-quality rice year-round other than suppliers like Vietnam. It is clear our current policy when it comes to agriculture exports to Cuba is not working. Cuba imports about 70% of its food. By law, our farmers have the freedom to export to Cuba, but in practice, the government seems to get in the way. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we can effectively implement already existing U.S. policy that allows agriculture exports to Cuba. I'll now yield to the ranking member from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being here today to discuss agricultural trade with Cuba, and it's fitting that we have representatives from the Department of the Treasury, Agriculture, and Commerce with us this afternoon to give us their particular perspectives and on the benefits and opportunities that lay ahead of us. This is obviously a time when the United States is reassessing its policy with Cuba. The administration has reestablished diplomatic relationships with Cuba, removed Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, and issued new regulations easing certain restrictions on travel, remittances, trade, and financial services. The President has also stated he looks forward to engaging Congress in a debate about lifting the trade embargo. This is a debate that will be met with optimism, restraint, and passion by supporters and opponents alike. I understand the desire for a different relationship with Cuba and the excitement surrounding new commercial opportunities in the Cuban market. Currently, Cuba imports about 80% of its food. Next to the European Union, China, and Brazil, the countries with the two highest suppliers. There's no denying that there are substantial opportunities for the United States businesses, particularly in the agricultural industry. However, I remain cautious with regard to how well-intended policies may impact those hurt most by the regime's policies, the Cuban people. Conditions on the island have not changed appreciably. The Cuban government continues to jail political dissidents without just cause, engages in other human rights abuses, and fails to respect the rule of law. Fundamentally, we can agree that the Cuban government does not afford Cuban people the political and economic freedom that they deserve. My main concern with opening up agricultural trade is the same concern I have with respect to the possibility of increased trade with Cuba generally. Who benefits? While I look at our renewed relations with the island as an opportunity for new commercial endeavors, it is foremost an opportunity for the Cuban government to demonstrate its commitment to reforms at home. And so I look forward to hearing from our witnesses concerning existing agricultural trade with Cuba, why U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba have decreased, and how the administration's recent policy and regulatory changes might impact agricultural trade with Cuba in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair is going to recognize other members that are present, even not on this subcommittee, but are here because of this hearing. Chair will recognize each for 1 minute. First will be the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Eliana Ross-Layton, the chair of the Middle East Subcommittee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. From an economic perspective, the very concept of trade and investment in Cuba is grounded in a misconception about how business takes place on the island. In Cuba, every single foreign trade transaction has been with the Castro regime or individuals acting on behalf of the regime. Since passage of the 2000 Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act, nearly $5 billion in U.S. agricultural and medical products have been sold to Cuba. It is an inconvenient truth, however, that all of those sales, all of them, by more than 250 privately owned U.S. companies, were made to only one Cuban buyer, the Cuban regime. According to our U.S. Department of Agriculture itself, quote, the key difference in exporting to Cuba compared to other countries in the region is that all U.S. agricultural products must be channeled through one Cuban government agency, Alimport. Exporting to Cuba is not about trading with small or mid-sized farmers or businesses or manufacturers around the island, as some Americans would have you believe. Little imported food or medicine ever makes it into the stores where Cubans shop, nor is it available on ration cards. It is gobbled up by high-ranking officials inside the regime. And one last point, Mr. Chairman, the Castro regime has proven time and time again that it will not pay its bills, it has not paid its creditors, and it has not paid U.S. certified claim holders. And so we have put in place this cash in advance provision to protect U.S. agriculture industry and to ensure that U.S. businesses are paid. And I have a series of questions when I'm allowed to ask our witnesses. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair will recognize Mr. Emmer from Minnesota for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I appreciate your leadership on this issue and allowing me to join my former committee to discuss an issue that I care about deeply. My state of Minnesota was one of the first to send a delegation to Cuba after Congress made exceptions to the embargo for agricultural commodities and medical supplies in 2000. Cuba, who imports, as you heard, nearly 80% of its food, is a natural market for American agricultural products. On a recent trip to Cuba, I met with several Cuban citizens and private business owners who want to increase trade with the U.S. because they are convinced this will create more opportunity for the Cuban people as a whole. While your topic today involves a discussion of regulatory barriers to agricultural trade and the actions of government, this discussion in today's hearing is really about people, Americans and Cubans alike, who see renewed opportunities in expanding trade. I thank the witnesses for their time and expertise, and I look forward to their testimony. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating, for allowing me to join this subcommittee hearing as a guest today. Chairman Poe and I have worked closely together to identify opportunities for engagement with Cuba, particularly as applies to ag trade and specifically rice. As he mentioned, a little more than a year ago, we authored a letter to Treasury and OFAC requesting an easing of cash in advance for trade restrictions on U.S. ag exports to Cuba. I'd like to thank Mr. Smith and your team for doing exactly what we asked and taking steps toward making U.S. ag more competitive in a country that's so close to our shores and imports around 80% of its food supply. While we've made progress on the executive level, I believe there's a lot more we can do. We can be doing here in Congress to further expand trade opportunities and permit travel. As a member from a district where ag is the #1 industry, I'm focused on removing barriers to ag trade, so this hearing is very relevant to those efforts. And again, I thank the chairman and ranking member.
Gentleman yields back his time. Without objection, all the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record, and I ask that each witness please keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. There is a light in front of you that will indicate that you can talk, you can slow down, and you can quit. I'll introduce each witness and then give them time for their opening statements. John Smith is Acting Director of the Office of Foreign Assistance Control at the Treasury Department, which is responsible for administering economic and trade sanctions. Prior to joining OFAC, Mr. Smith served as an expert to the United Nations and was a trial lawyer with the Department of Justice. Mr. Karsting is an administrator of the Foreign Agricultural Service of the Department of Agriculture. Previously served more than 22 years on Capitol Hill working on appropriations, agriculture, and development issues. And Mr. Matt Borman is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce. Mr. Borman joined the Commerce Department in 1992 and has spent his career largely focusing on export implementation and enforcement. Mr. Smith, we'll start with you, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Chairman Poe, Ranking Members Keating, and distinguished members. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss potential opportunities to expand agricultural trade with Cuba. I'll be addressing key regulatory amendments made by Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, in January to implement changes to U.S. policy toward Cuba announced by the President in December, as well as the restrictions that remain in place. The regulatory changes are intended to create opportunities for increased agricultural exports to Cuba, among other benefits to U.S. business. These changes ease Cuba sanctions within the continuing constraints of the embargo, while advancing the administration's policy to further engage and empower the Cuban people. The January rule changes benefit American exporters in at least 5 key respects. First, OFAC expanded the financing provisions of the regulations to allow America's agricultural exporters to be more competitive in selling their wares to Cuba. Second, OFAC broadened the ability of U.S. financial institutions to provide services and effectuate payments for exporters and others authorized to engage in trade with Cuba. Third, OFAC authorized trade delegations and exporters satisfying the conditions of our regulations to travel to Cuba and engage in associated authorized transactions without the need to apply to OFAC for a specific license. Fourth, OFAC expanded certain humanitarian projects in Cuba, including those related to agricultural and rural development that promote independent activity. And finally, OFAC eased restrictions to better provide efficient and adequate telecommunications services between the United States and Cuba, and to increase access to telecommunications and internet-based services for the Cuban people. I'll talk about a few of these in more detail. As an initial matter, OFAC, as has been mentioned, OFAC modified the regulatory interpretation of the term cash in advance, which describes a financing requirement for agricultural trade between the United States and Cuba. In addition, to improve the speed, efficiency, and oversight of authorized payments between the United States and Cuba, OFAC authorized U.S. banks to establish correspondent accounts at financial institutions in Cuba. This change was intended to ease the flow of authorized payments and eliminate the need for third country payment structures, which should benefit U.S. exporters to Cuba. Another of our changes related to travel. OFAC's Cuba Sanctions Program is our only sanctions program that restricts travel to a country. The January regulatory amendments ease the travel restrictions by authorizing certain additional travel within the 12 existing categories of travel in our regulations without the need to apply to a specific license from OFAC. Travel to Cuba for tourist activities, though, remains prohibited. The additional and expanded general licenses for travel are intended to make it easier for Americans to interact with the Cuban people and for trade delegations and authorized exporters to travel to Cuba to promote their products. Even with these changes that I've described, most transactions between the United States and Cuba, including most import, exports, and other activities, remain prohibited. As OFAC implements these regulatory changes, we'll continue to enforce the Cuba Sanctions Program and take actions against violators as appropriate. The President's December announcement laid out a new course for our relations with Cuba, driven by a hope for a more positive future for the Cuban people. Our regulatory amendments to our Cuban Assets Control regulations, in concert with the regulation amendments that were issued by the Commerce Department, mark significant changes to our Cuba sanctions that implement the new policy announced by the President. These changes are intended to benefit the Cuban people and help them to freely determine their own future, as well as to support U.S. business and American exporters to Cuba. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Carson.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, members of the subcommittee, and special guests, I'm pleased to come before you today to discuss agricultural trade with Cuba. As President Obama announced last December, the administration is charting a new course with Cuba in its drive to further engage and empower the Cuban people. The measures being taken also expand opportunities for America's farmers and ranchers. In January, the Treasury Department published regulatory changes, including a revised interpretation of the term cash in advance and authorization for U.S. banks to establish correspondent banking accounts at Cuban banks. These changes had been sought by members of the U.S. agricultural community. Also, after more than half a century of isolation, the United States reopened its embassy in Havana on July 20. USDA and many of its stakeholders are excited about this new chapter in U.S.-Cuba relations. 15 years ago, Congress lifted the ban on agricultural exports to Cuba that had been in place for decades. Despite that opening, U.S. government agencies, including USDA, remain statutorily prohibited from providing export assistance and any credit or guarantees for exports to Cuba. As Secretary Vilsack has said, he cannot currently use a single dollar of trade promotion funding for our trade with Cuba. These restrictions apply to the Foreign Agricultural Service's successful cooperative market development programs like the Market Access Program and the Foreign Market Development Program. Though the policy changes announced and implemented by the President are significant, we still have legislative hurdles to cross, and USDA stands ready to provide technical assistance to you and other members as Congress considers further changes. If remaining statutory limitations were removed, we could be poised to become a major trading partner with Cuba. Cuba depends heavily on imports to feed its 11 million citizens. According to the World Food Program, Cuba imports between 70 to 80% of its food, which means the potential for our producers is significant. The United States has potentially huge structural advantages in exporting to Cuba. Chief among them is location. We are less than 100 miles away, meaning lower shipping costs and transit times, especially compared to our current top competitors, Brazil and Europe. In fiscal year 2008, the U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba reached $658 million. However, by the end of the last fiscal year, they had fallen by more than half to $300 million. Yet at the same time, global agricultural exports to Cuba have doubled over the past decade to more than $2 billion. Last year, the largest U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba were poultry, soybean meal, soybeans, and corn. I am confident U.S. farmers, ranchers, and exporters are poised to capture markets in Cuba, but I don't want to minimize the obstacles. In addition to those I mentioned a moment ago, we bear in mind two overarching factors. First, Cuba is a country with limited foreign exchange and our foreign competitors in market development. Another impediment to trade is Cuba's tightly controlled import policy requiring that all U.S. agricultural imports be channeled through one state corporation and supported more than 1 million Americans. For U.S. agricultural exports around the globe is considerable. It's also critically important that we have trade agreements that support and create U.S. jobs while helping American agriculture to compete even more successfully. For example, USDA trade negotiators are currently working with USTR to advocate on behalf of U.S. agriculture in two major negotiations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. Once these agreements are in place, U.S. agricultural producers will enjoy improved access to markets representing 2/3 of the global economy. In conclusion, there is significant potential for expanding U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba. Reestablishment of diplomatic relations and reopening our embassy is simply the first step of a longer normalization process between the United States and Cuba. Agriculture has long served as a bridge to foster cooperation, understanding, and the exchange of ideas among people, and I have no doubt that American agriculture will play an important role as we expand our relationship with the Cuban people.
Thank you. Mr. Borman.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Keating, members and guests of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today to address the role of the Department of Commerce with regard to regulating agricultural trade with Cuba. As you know, on December 17, 2014, the President announced the most significant shift in Cuba policy in more than 50 years. As he noted, these changes are intended to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people by increasing commerce, authorized travel, and the free flow of information. To implement aspects of the President's new approach, the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce has amended the Export Administration regulations twice, first on January 16th and then second on July 22nd. The January 16th amendments created a new license exception, which is our equivalent of a Treasury General license, called Support for the Cuban People, which is focused on allowing U.S. exporters to send certain items to Cuba for private sector economic activity and civic society without an individual license. We also expanded the scope of our license exception on gift parcels and humanitarian donations and revised our license exception on consumer communication devices, all to facilitate the movement of those goods to Cuba. The July 22nd amendment to the regulations implemented the Secretary of State's decision to remove Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. Specifically to exports of agricultural products, the measures that were announced by the President and implemented in both of our regulations did not change the Export Administration regulations in regard to BIS authorization of exports of agricultural commodities. The Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, TISRA, governs how we regulate exports of agricultural commodities to Cuba. To implement TISRA, we created a license exception, Agricultural Commodities, AGR, which is really an expedited individual licensing process. This allows agricultural commodities to go to Cuba under a expedited process. They have to provide, exporters have to provide prior notice. We review those prior notices with the Department of State and typically give an answer to the exporter within 12 business days. Consistent with TISRA, this expedited review process includes screening the ultimate consignee, or the customer in Cuba, to ensure the recipient does not promote international terrorism and that the transaction does not raise proliferation concerns. If the transaction meets the terms and conditions of the license exception, AGR, exporters may proceed with the transaction once we confirm that neither reviewing agency has raised an objection. In addition, exports of agricultural commodities must be made pursuant to a written contract and must take place within 1 year of the signing of a contract unless the export is a commercial sample or donation. And in that case, the contract requirement doesn't apply. During calendar year 2014, BIS processed 56 agricultural export notifications valued at about $2.4 billion, and we had an average processing time of 10 days. Multiple shipments may be made pursuant to a single notification, And you should keep in mind that the dollar value, the 2.4 billion, reflects the proposed export, not the value of actual exports. As you heard from Mr. Carson, the dollar value of actual exports last year was just a little bit under $300 million. But in any event, in 2014, exporters made 600 shipments of agricultural products to Cuba. In Cuba, only state-run companies are authorized to engage in foreign trade transactions, and often a whole category of commodities imported from the United States is channeled through specific companies depending on the sector. And of course, folks have already mentioned I'll import in the agricultural area. That really summarizes how we at Commerce regulate the export of agricultural commodities to Cuba. And with my fellow panelists, we'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Chair recognizes itself for questions. How come we are exporting less rice to Cuba than we were in 2009? What's the reason?
I think it's hard for us to get inside the mind of Alamport to find out what rice.
Concern is the exporting of rice. What's good for the United States? What's good for American businesses with this question? As I mentioned in my opening statement.
I mean, I can start and
Sure,
just say
Mr. Smith.
to the extent that we hear from exporters, and I'm sure you all hear from exporters as well, we can speculate on why trade may have gone up or down, but probably the primary thing that we hear from exporters, at least on the Treasury side, is the lack of availability of financing or credit that they can get. They tell us that their competitors in other countries can get, whether it's private financing or government financing, and we're restricted by statute from allowing that.
So if we change the statute, we'd have to change the statute to allow the exporter to assume the risk of whether Cuba pays or not. We've already heard that they don't pay their bills, but why not let the exporter assume that risk?
I think that's a decision for Congress to make. It's
Okay.
in the statute.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Y'all are awful
In the
quiet.
statute, yes.
How does the state-run government company put U.S. exporters at a disadvantage? Alamport. How does that put us at a disadvantage?
Clearly, they've been making purchasing decisions since 2009 where both the variety of the exports that we've sent over there as well as the dollar value have gone down. So they're making purchase decisions going with other suppliers. A lot of the other suppliers have been in country for some time, developing relationships, helping to create demand, presumably. And that's what I think a lot of our stakeholders in the agriculture community are looking for as we look to this new relationship, that same sort of advantage.
Mr. Borman, any comment?
I don't really have anything to add to that.
I have a constituent, Ms. Rogers, who claims that she's owed more than $40 million from the Cuban government. Grandfather brought John Deere and Caterpillar to Cuba. She's one of many 6,000 claimants against the Cuban government for their actions 50 years ago. What is the status of those claims as a whole? Claims against the Cuban government for confiscation of property and assets belonging to others. Mr. Keating, Mr. Smith?
I was just going to say, I think that that's, the State Department has the primary jurisdiction. I think they have ongoing discussions or planned discussions. That's outside of the Treasury Department expertise.
Do either Mr. Carson or Boren know any status of either one of those or any of those claims?
No.
There's a political issue. It has become a political issue, is it not, in the overall discussion of whether or not we should open up to Cuba or Cuba open up to the United States? Is that a fair statement, Mr. Smith?
I mean, it's certainly an issue for the administration and for Congress to weigh. We still have in our Treasury regulations the provisions from the statute that do not allow any financing or other credit to be provided involving transactions for confiscated property. So we still have that restriction in our regulations that's in the statute. I think when you're talking about any further discussions involving those claims, I think that is very much of a matter for the diplomatic side of our government along with Congress to consider.
I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think at least a couple of you mentioned in your testimony that's the intent to benefit the Cuban people, or it's the hope that some of these changes that benefit the Cuban people. What can we do to ensure more that this will actually benefit the Cuban people and not just the regime? It's not in these regulations or enforcing some of these new changes.
I think for the Treasury Department, and I think Commerce has had a similar philosophy, at least for for the Treasury Department, when we looked at the regulatory changes that we made, we looked to see how they could impact and help the Cuban people and how we could restrict the government from benefiting. And many of ours where we may allow increased remittances, for example, we excluded the government of Cuba or Cuban Communist Party officials. So we tried to focus it on what might be individuals and moving it away from the government. When we talked about increasing travel from U.S. persons, it's the philosophy of Americans are the best ambassadors for America to actually get the message to the Cuban people about how a democracy works. And so when you go down each one of our changes, each one of the categories, we tried to focus on how we could help the Cuban people. And I think that's what we continue to look at.
How's that working? Or is it working? Do you have any?
I would say just on the point of having Americans as ambassadors for change, I mean, American farmers and American agriculture have been doing that for a long time in our farmer-to-farmer exchange programs. And that cohort of people that are primarily my stakeholders are very anxious to get on with that task. And I think talking to farmers is a great way to reinforce those changes.
And sir, we've seen a significant number of exports made under the license exceptions, for example, the donations, which I think we're fairly confident actually go to the intended recipients, in part because the people make the donations would learn if their intended recipients didn't receive them. And we continue to try to educate U.S. exporters who would like to make these exports to the private sector, to civic groups in Cuba, on how to make sure that they identify who those foreign parties, the Cuban parties are, to make sure that they're going to the authorized end users.
Well, realizing that you're not advocating in your official capacities for any particular change in the future, can you at least share with us some thoughts you might have heard from others, if they're not even your own personal feelings, about what further changes we can make to try and enhance our ability to help the Cuban people directly? And I realize you're not speaking for your own opinion or for the department.
I think a lot of our stakeholders have made clear that the ability to have a little more flexibility with regard to our market promotion programs, MAP, our market access program, emerging markets program, those things that help us focus on trade missions, reverse trade missions, those sorts of things would be, I think they would say those would be really valuable to us.
Trade promotion area too. One of the new regulations provides that certain goods produced by independent Cuban entrepreneurs are eligible to be imported into the U.S. Can you define that term, independent Cuban entrepreneurs, for me, and give me an idea what you anticipate would be imported with this new change in term?
The State Department has put out a list of what would be constituting independent Cuban entrepreneurs. I think the way they did it is they took categories that they thought would not be appropriate, that would traditionally were not for small business or entrepreneurs that were really state controlled. They put that on the list, and then they said other things could be allowed. But this is a State Department function in determining, and we authorized what the State Department put on its list. So that's a State Department expertise.
And lastly, you mentioned how tourism changes can help some of the agricultural business. Can you just comment on how that can happen, some personal observations or some thoughts as how that would translate?
I think in any number of countries, there's a lot of different markets within one country. You know, we think of bulk commodities, wheat, rice, corn, soy going to one group, but there's also significant hotel restaurant trade in different countries, and the potential for tourism and restaurant trade in Cuba is significant. I think they were 2.8 million last year, up to 3 million this coming year. That's a little different market, and one that will seek different products.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for having this hearing. I appreciate Chairman Judge Ted Poe for his leadership. And this is so important about agricultural trade with Cuba. President Obama has thrown the Cuban communist dictatorship a lifeline by restoring diplomatic relations. I don't believe this is in the interest of the people of Cuba. In fact, this dictatorship had as a patron the Soviet Union, then it had as a patron Hugo Chavez, and both of those experiences have proven Margaret Thatcher correct, that socialism will exist until you run out of spending other people's money. The businesses in Cuba are dominated by the Castro regime, a military mafia, stolen from the Cuban people. So is the oppressive regime that the benefits from trade are to a mafia, not to the people of Cuba. I learned firsthand of the expropriation and that of stolen property from extraordinary constituents. A neighbor of mine was a business person in Cuba, had a plumbing business. He was just a wonderful person, a dear family man with wonderful 4 young daughters, and he knew that because as an anti-communist he was going to be picked up. And so he went to the local department store back in 1959, and he got luggage, went back home. Before he got home, the secret police were there. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, we're going to be visiting a sick aunt in New York." And so the children were told, "Pack whatever you can. We're not coming back." They didn't come back. But what an American success and dream. In South Carolina, they then developed one of the largest plumbing businesses in our state. And so, but it's just horrific to think of rewarding people who have stolen property. Mr. Smith, Cuba is one of the last remaining Cuban communist dictatorships, and that is of Marxist-Leninist theory of state ownership, means of production, and business. But with the communist allies now liberated, thank God, state ownership has shifted to the Cuban military. What percentage of business industry is owned by and operated by the Cuban military, and what percentage may be operated by the elite of the Communist Party?
Sir, I don't have that statistic. I rely on the State Department for that. I know that when we talk about owned by the Cuban government, we're talking about an overwhelming majority. I've heard 75, 85% figures, but when you say the military itself, I don't have that statistic versus government ownership.
Well, actually, the numbers you gave are what I have heard too, that at least 70% of all business would be with the Cuban military. But in between, you have, as has been in the post-communist experience of other countries, a mafia develop. Mr. Bourne, as is the experience, it's hard to believe, because of experience, hard to believe the increased trade will help the Cuban people. The evidence is clear. The Castro regime had 30 years of subsidized trade with the Soviet Union and billions of dollars in European investment, yet none of the profits made its way to the Cuban people. What makes us think that adding the U.S. to the equation would be different except to prop up a corrupt dictatorship?
So the changes to our regulations we've made allow the export of items to the private sector in Cuba, and there are now about 200 categories of employment that are private sector employment that are legal in Cuba. So if someone's to make that export, it has to go to one of those private sector activities. These are not, with the exception of telecom, going to the Cuban government. And the telecom is to facilitate communications among the Cubans, between the Cubans and the rest of the world.
So you say private sector. Who would be the private sector?
There are agricultural co-ops, for example. There are people who run small restaurants, auto repair shops, those kinds of things. And those kinds of activities are legal in Cuba now in the private sector. So what are the percentages I've heard is roughly 85% of the Cuban economy is currently government controlled, and about 15% is in this space, several 100,000 people.
Well, I would certainly look into that, because I had the opportunity, and I was really grateful to be in Shanghai, and I saw these different businesses that were operating, and then somebody whispered to me, and they had beautiful logos, and it was very impressive. I found out they were all state-owned. None were independently operated. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. and thank you all for your testimony and for being here with us today. Let me ask you, and for whoever is appropriate to answer this, if there was trade between our two countries in agriculture, which specific states or regions of the country would benefit most from that?
I think we see a lot of opportunity in certain commodity sectors, rice and poultry, wheat, corn, soy. So any states that produces those, certainly the states that are involved in processing and shipping those, so our port, the Port of Houston, Port of New Orleans, I imagine just all of our ports. But at USDA, when I look at agricultural exports overall, I'm sort of agnostic about where they come from, because we know that it helps all farmers, all producers everywhere if we grow markets overseas. So I think there would probably be some localized improvements, but it's good for everybody if we sell more.
And let's imagine that you said today that we were going to have normalized trading relationship with Cuba. How long would it actually take to start that up, practically speaking?
Well, of course, that would be assuming that all the legislative barriers are taken away.
Right.
Then it's hard to say how long that would take, because the Cuban economy, as you've heard, is still significantly dominated by the government, and to overcome many years of where they've been, that would take quite a bit of time for them to sort of develop markets, U.S. companies to figure out what the markets were.
Right. And imagine that the United States Congress was okay with it.
Right.
What would be the time lag after that, in your best estimation?
I would say for the programs that I manage within the Foreign Agricultural Service, to treat Cuba like other countries with regard to market access program, foreign market development, emerging market programs, would just take not very long at all to change the notice that goes out to our cooperators, the private sector groups we work with, to say, okay, now you can do things in Cuba. We would still look at them with the same level of scrutiny that we look at all the things that come to us, and say we want to make sure that they've got good plans, they're spending resources wisely. But as a matter of turning the switch, it wouldn't take that long.
Okay. And then I apologize, I came in a little late, and I know some of this ground may have been covered, but what's the annual loss in terms of trade for not being able to trade with Cuba?
It's kind of hard to quantify what we're losing. We went from a high of $658 million in 2009. We're now at about $300 million a year in agricultural trade. Meanwhile, their imports from other countries have grown to about $2 billion. So our market share has declined, and their market has grown in terms of an export destination for ag stuff.
Sorry, another way to look at it is, last year we authorized about $2.4 billion in ag exports to Cuba, but only a small percentage, roughly $300 million, were actually made. So clearly the folks who came in seeking authorization saw a potential sale there, but the actual sales were far less than that.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. The chair yields to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Right. Good to see you all. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm to tell you the truth, a little disappointed there's not somebody here from state, and so my questions kind of probably are more involved in that. But in that interest, how much do any of you folks get involved with the state's policy regarding the communist state of Cuba, and how do we know, as individuals and people that support exporters, regardless of where they're from in the United States, how do we track how those goods and services go to the Cuban people as opposed to enhancing the government? Is there any way to know that? And do you get involved in that? Anybody?
Well, sorry, we at Commerce do. You've got two ways that goods subject to our jurisdiction can go to Cuba, either under an individual license, which means the exporter has to come in with an application, say who they are, who they want to sell to, and what the item is. And then there's an interagency process that reviews that and determines, is that consistent with our policy? So certainly we would vet the end user, and in that scenario you'd have very few circumstances where approvals would go if the item was to go to a government end user. There are some exceptions, like medical
buyer,
devices.
Right? There's essentially one buyer.
Well, but then from there, it depends what the product is. It might go to a government end user like a hospital, because the government controls all the hospitals, but it could go to a retail store where it's eventually sold to any Cuban person off the street. Then on the license exception side, the way we've created this is we've told people you can make certain exports without individual licenses, which means we in the government don't review the end user. But you have to determine yourself that it's essentially in the private sector, and that's where we're continuing to try to educate U.S. companies and U.S. exporters on who's in the private sector. And then on the back end, once items are in Cuba, I think it's very likely that if they don't go to the intended recipient, the U.S. exporter will let us know, particularly if it's somebody who's selling something to a relative, say, who's running an auto repair shop, and they send them a toolkit, and that toolkit doesn't make it. I'm confident that that intended recipient will let their relative know that. So that's kind of the way we would look at
I mean,
that.
does it get down to that level? I mean, how do you know? If you're talking about a toolkit, let's say you send a tap and die set. I don't know if they have the provisions to make stuff like that in Cuba. I don't know what their capacity is. But let's just say you send that and the recipient never gets it. I mean, are you going to find a $200 or $300 tool set in the scope of, the kind of numbers you're talking, arguably, even though they're diminished by half?
You're also talking about an issue that's general to export controls generally, not just Cuba. But, for example, one of the data points I've heard is that last year there was about $2.6 billion in remittances that went from the U.S. to Cuba, and over 50% of that probably went to small businesses. So again, those typically, I think, are going to be from friends or relatives in the United States who have friends or relatives in Cuba running those businesses. So I think they would tell them, I'm sending you X, an auto repair kit or something. And when that intended recipient, if they didn't receive it, they would let the sender know, and then they would likely contact us. So there are ways to try to monitor that.
And then what's the penalty? What happens then?
So it would really, and sorry, one other thing, of course, we also are continually monitoring open source and classified information to see if there's anything significant that would come up in terms of unauthorized diversion of items. Penalties, they can be criminal penalties with jail time, they can be criminal fines and also administrative fines and denial of export privileges, so they can be fairly significant.
To the exporter?
Well, it can be to the exporter or to the foreign party who would then go on a public denied persons list, which would then mean nobody could send anything to them without authorization.
How often does that occur?
Well, it occurs a lot. I mean, we have a denied persons list, which has dozens and dozens of foreign parties on it. And then we have other restricted lists that tell the public you can't send to them without government approval.
So from a strategic standpoint, how does our trade policy, how does that comport with our aversion to the communist government in Cuba? How do we get to where we want to be to not have a communist government in Cuba through our export policy?
Well, I'm not sure that it can get to that stage. Certainly the stage
How does it enhance it, or how does it
well, certainly
fit in the
it would
strategy?
be, the policy would be not to allow things that would go to the Communist Party, the Cuban government, the military. Certainly that's the policy that continues to be in place. And so, for example, the other thing to keep in mind is the items that are eligible for these license exceptions or general authorizations, they are very low-level items. They're not items controlled by the multilateral non-proliferation regimes. Those would still all need a license. And so if somebody came in for a license for one of those items, like a big machine tool, 5-axis machine tool, and they said, we want it to go to the Cuban Ministry of Industry to produce aircraft, that would be denied. So that's the way we deal with that as well.
Are there any provisions for marking, or information that goes along with the goods or services?
Well, there are requirements that the documentation that goes with it lays out who they can and can't go to.
Okay.
But for these lower-level items, it's not clear to me that people would want to try to put tracking or other devices on them.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank
Chair
you, Mr.
recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Eliana Ross-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I have questions for Mr. Smith and Mr. Borman, and I would appreciate it if you could give me written responses as soon as possible. Mr. Smith, the January 2015 OFAC rule permits persons to import into the United States goods from Cuba, including tobacco and alcohol, and permits U.S. persons to use credit and debit cards from U.S. financial institutions to pay for these transactions. Congress has prohibited U.S. financial institutions and persons to extend financing with respect to any transaction involving property confiscated by the Cuban regime. So if a credit card is used by a person to purchase alcohol or tobacco, such a transaction would involve the extension of a short-term loan or credit by a U.S. financial institution to consummate a transaction involving confiscated property. So I would ask you, how doesn't this new OFAC regulation not contravene U.S. law? And I would like that answer in writing. And secondly, a recent news story stated, quote, a $3 million yacht left Key West this week with 2 barbecue grills, 250 channels of satellite TV, and a just-in-case plan for rescuing stranded Cuban rafters encountered in the Florida Straits. After 4 hours of smooth sailing, the still water tied up at Havana's Hemingway Marina. The well-heeled passengers breakfasted on smoked salmon and pastries, then boarded an air-conditioned Cuban government bus for a day of touring the city, end quote. Surely you're aware that tourism travel to Cuba is illegal, so how do these elite luxury yacht trips not constitute illegal tourist activities, or is your department just looking the other way? Mr. Borman, 2 questions for you, sir. The January 2015 BIS rule correctly cited the 1992 Cuban Democracy Act as granting the Department of Commerce authorities to permit certain exports that promote telecommunication connections with Cuba. Yet the same rule remained conspicuously silent as to where BIS purportedly derived its statutory authority to create the Support for Cuban People license exemption for non-telecommunication items. So the Libertad Act explicitly ratified all these restrictions, codified the comprehensive trade embargo against Cuba. Thus, how do your regulations, these new BIS regulations, not contravene U.S. law? What gives you the power to do that? And lastly, Mr. Borman, in the past, you have acknowledged that exports under the Support for the Cuban People license exemption would have to go through a Castro-owned intermediary, this bogus companies, as the regime controls all foreign trade on the island, as we have discussed. Funneling exports through the Castro regime is inarguably in contravention of the foreign policy objectives of the U.S. as codified by statute. So again, I would ask you, Mr. Borman, how does this BIS regulation not contravene U.S. law? And Mr. Chairman, if I may, my answer to your question about the decrease in sales, the reality is that the Castro regime knows and understands the U.S. very well, and it is purposely, I believe, dropping the amount of sales right now of U.S. agricultural products so that the ag industry falls for this ruse and advocates for loosening of sanctions, and more concessions to the Castro regime will not help the Cuban people, will only fill the coffers of the monopolies that have been created by the regime. And if I could just point to this, our local affiliate of NBC put out this tweet. It's being followed live on Miami television, a sad scene that gets replayed every day. This is right off my congressional district, right off Key Biscayne. These are Cuban migrants trying to come to the United States. They did not get the memo about the paradise that is there in Cuba when all of these sanctions will be lifted, and they're a record number in recent history of Cuban rafters coming into the United States. So maybe you have a statement that you could give me to tell these folks how things are going to get so much better for them once we lift all these restrictions. And I was wondering if you knew that since the December 17th Obama announcement, there have been a record number of arrests of dissident and opposition leaders in Cuba who are calling for freedom and human rights, and they did not get the memo of how everything with these ag products is going to improve their plight and their families' plight. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would appreciate it if the gentleman could give me those responses rapidly. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. The 4
Pray for
questions
my voice.
submitted or that will be submitted in writing to you. I know you're trying to write them down.
No, I've got them here.
They will be submitted to you in writing and return the answers not only to the gentlelady from Florida but to the chair as well. Thank the gentlelady for. Hope you get to feeling better. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses for being here today. I come from a state, Minnesota, that one of the 2 major drivers of our private economy is agriculture. And it's always about finding markets, not just in the United States, but beyond our borders. And when it comes to Cuba, when the exception was made more than a decade ago, Minnesota was one of the first to send a delegation to Cuba and open up the relationship. It's important to our state when we're talking about export markets and growing trade opportunities. And I think it was Mr. Karsting who said earlier, who testified that lifting the embargo would help farmers in general. It would help all farmers. And I guess I want to go from there. What sectors, if you will, and whoever has the expertise or all of you, what sectors in our agricultural industry in this country are hurt most by the U.S. trade embargo?
I think we've seen losses in wheat and rice, and you could go down the laundry list of bulk commodities and look at who's gone up and who's gone down over time, and that'd be sort of a rough way to look at it. I think wheat and rice are two of the principal ones. Poultry exports remain pretty strong. But in general, what we've seen since, from 2005 compared to today, Cuba used to buy a much greater variety of goods, and now that variety of goods has been diminished. There's also been a fundamental shift in U.S. agricultural exports in the last decade or two. We sell a lot more processed and intermediate products these days than we did a decade or two ago. So there's probably potential opportunity in each one of those categories. It's hard for me to say exactly which one is going to be, which one is going to shine. Ask me in 10 years, and maybe we'll have some good numbers on that.
What are there anything, and maybe again, I don't know which one of you this is most appropriate for, but we've talked about you've testified to what the administration has done. There might be an argument if they're within their authority or not. But is there more that can still be done, you believe, without congressional action to open up the Cuban marketplace?
I think the authority within my agency, where we would go now, does require action by Congress. Our principal export promotion programs that I've mentioned before, we can't use that as we can't spend a single dollar on any sort of export promotion. So, we would love to be in an environment where we have a little more on the ground intelligence in country. And when I say intelligence, I mean I mean our ag attaches, those sorts of things. At some point, we currently run all of our Caribbean operations out of an office in Miami. So we will see what that take it one step at a time.
Mr. Smith, you were talking about some of the things that have been done through this administration's actions, including broadening the ability of financial institutions to do more. And I think the gentlelady from Florida was referring to debit cards, et cetera. You had referred to U.S. banks, financial institutions can now have correspondent relationships in Cuba. How many of those exist at this moment? Has that started already?
To my knowledge, there's only one financial institution that's opened a correspondent account in Cuba. I think when you have Cuba is one of our toughest sanctions programs. The variety of requirements that we have under our sanctions and the penalties that we impose for violations, and most people are aware of the major penalties that we've instituted when we find that a financial institution has run afoul of our sanctions, lead banks to be very, very cautious. And so I think if you ask me what my expectation would be, is that until there is a greater interest for the bank, until there is more trade or interest from big American companies, you'll have banks that are very cautious about getting in until the profit is greater for them.
Wow. But taking that one step farther, it's not just that, but isn't it true that with the embargo still in place, there isn't going to be a rush of banks, financial institutions entering into Cuba?
I think that's right. As I said at the beginning, even with these changes, most imports, most exports, and most other transactions remain prohibited between the United States and Cuba. Given that landscape, there is not that great of an incentive for financial institutions to rush in across the board.
Lastly, could you expand on your testimony earlier that you said the administration, through its actions, have expanded certain humanitarian projects in Cuba?
Sure,
Can you expand on that?
Sure, we issued a general license. That's a regulatory authorization that allows U.S. persons to provide to do certain activities within what we define as the humanitarian field. Within the humanitarian field, we define what we mean by that. So it may be certain medical or educational or other types of projects, including certain microfinancing type activities. And we also authorize in that area more remittances in an unlimited category where we might have restrictions in other categories. So we've been working in that area. We also allow travel for that purpose as well.
And I think lastly, with what little time I might have left, Mr. Karsten, you were talking about the farmer-to-farmer programs. Can you, for people that are here, can you tell us how do those work?
We do a number of sort of educational exchange programs, and farmer to farmer can be one of them. Often when we send trade missions overseas, U.S. producers will go and accompany their sales executives, and that turns into a de facto farmer to farmer exchange. We also have two other programs that we administer. There's the Normandy Borlaug Exchange Program and the Cochrane Exchange Program. The Borlaug relates more to graduate level PhD research exchanges. The Cochrane program deals with a lot of very practical on the ground, sort of this is the way you manage cold supply chain, any number of sorts of things. So we do exchange programs around the globe, but obviously not with Cuba unless there's a change in the law.
And okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question perhaps best directed to the State Department, but since they're not part of this panel, I'll direct it to any and all of you who can answer it. Are there any barriers in place that you know of that restrict Cuban ag customers and officials from coming to the United States for the purpose of developing business relationships or conducting quality control activities like safety and quality inspections?
We're not bringing in Cuban agricultural products, so there would be no reason for them to be here.
I guess maybe I should clarify what I'm asking there. Can they come here to develop relationships as it applies to U.S. businesses accessing Cuba?
That's a question I would leave to state.
I think that's more a State Department visa issue.
Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Karsten, some supporters of trade with Cuba have said that we need to keep the restrictions on FAS's market development programs to ensure that taxpayer money doesn't get into the hands of the Castro regime. Do you think that's a valid criticism, or are there enough safeguards in place that would prevent misappropriation?
Our use of these market development programs, just by way of background, that's one of our signature public-private partnerships. So we cooperate with about 86 different groups out there, private sector groups that promote agricultural exports overseas. So our agreement is with them, and they submit to us their strategies for building markets overseas. So I don't view that money as going directly into the coffers of any of their target countries. It's going into the hands and the control of U.S. producers and exporter groups for them to figure out, with our concurrence, what's the best strategy for growing and developing a market overseas. So I think there are a couple layers of protection in there that give me comfort on that. I want to back up a little bit to your earlier question. You talked about people coming over here. This is probably a good point to talk about. When we, an important part of USDA in many, many countries around the globe is not just for our FAS folks to have a presence there to figure out how we can grow opportunity for American agriculture, but also for our Animal Plant Health Inspection Service team to be on the ground to make sure that we protect American agriculture on the plant and animal health side of things too. So as we look down the road to a relationship with Cuba, it involves both of those elements.
Okay, thank you. And let me ask you, Mr. Karsten, would you say that Allenport is a concern in terms of quality of access and promoting U.S. products directly to consumers?
Ask that again?
Would you say that Allenport is a concern in terms of quality of access and promoting U.S. products directly to consumers?
Well, certainly a lot of our competitors don't go through Allenport, and so and it's a pretty opaque process. But you aren't able to change things unless you're there and able to build relationships, hopefully with end-use customers.
What recommendations would you, or anybody on the panel can answer this if they want to, would you have in terms of a policy shift that we could implement here that would enable producers to market directly into the Cuban market?
Like I mentioned before, the Secretary said we can't spend a single dollar of our MAP, EMP, or Cochrane Borlaug, those sorts of programs in Cuba. And that's something that Congress is going to have to grapple with. We can't unilaterally take any action on that.
And I think from the
we-
Treasury, oh, I'm sorry.
We at Commerce are also statutorily prohibited from doing our normal range of trade promotion and market analysis activities.
Okay.
in Cuba.
And on the Treasury's side, what we hear most from exporters are the cash in advance rules, meaning that they can't get a private financing either. They have to go
Okay.
through this.
So that's what we can't do. So I guess what I'm asking is recommendations from you, what we could do. And if I'm hearing you right, you think we could take some action to lift that?
That's a restriction in the statute, so it's in the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act that doesn't allow the private financing or the government financing, so that's
Which would be an
within that
essential piece
statute.
to this anyway, so you would recommend that that would be a starting point?
If Congress wanted to look at that, that is the place to go.
Okay.
And TISRA also has the restrictions on export assistance, which is what we were talking about
Okay.
in our agencies.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Thank all of our witnesses for being here. I thank our members of Congress, especially the ones not on the committee, for being here today as well. And the subcommittee is adjourned.